Welcome to the Main Street Counsel podcast.
Welcome back to the Main Street Counsel podcast with Ms. Jasmin Hurley. Jasmin Hurley is the founder of JH Legal and a transactional business attorney who brings big law experience to Main Street businesses. She helps owners make smart legal decisions before things feel urgent, explaining complex issues in plain English without panic or legalese. I'm Evan Mack, and today we're talking about business succession planning, specifically for owners who aren't planning to step away anytime soon. Ms. Jasmin, welcome back.
Hey, Evan, how are you?
Hi. So Jasmin, when business owners hear about succession planning, they often assume it only applies when they're retiring, is right around the corner. What does succession planning actually mean when someone plans to keep running their business for years to come?
Yeah, so when they're getting to that point of retiring, and now they're thinking about succession planning, it's a little too late. They're assuming that everything's going to go swimmingly in their business, right? It's never about them leaving. Succession planning is about ensuring that the business can survive all of the things that happen in a person's life, right? That pop up, that a health crisis, a key person leaves. If there's an opportunity to sell and there are partners in the business, then they decide that they want, one partner wants to leave. Those are all instances in which having a succession plan is incredibly important. It's documenting roles, who has the ability to make decisions, and what does that ownership structure look like after certain situations, whether it be death, disability, someone is just tired and wants to move on to the next step in their life into another adventure. So, it doesn't have to depend entirely on one person unless, you are that one person. If you are a one-person show, having a succession plan is incredibly important to have now because you never know what's going to happen.
So when, why does it actually usually make sense to think about a succession earlier than most owners expect, even when the business feels stable? Is it a stage of business where it becomes especially urgent in your experience?
You don't want it to be urgent because then that is when you have to be more reactive as opposed to proactive. Working through a succession plan in a way that you can create something that works for your business, that works for your partners, your other members of your business, that works for your family. If this happens to be a family-run business and this is something that you want to have moving on to your family members, being able to do this in a way that works to have a phased plan is incredibly helpful. And it can be expensive, but it tends to be less expensive when you're trying to put things in place right away. And when something has already happened, when a death, disability, a need to have some conservatorship happens, it's a little bit too late. You can't put certain things in place because the person cannot express their wishes for how they want that particular succession to happen because they're either not here anymore or they don't have the capacity to be able to do that. Being able to take advantage of those options earlier when you're not in that state of crisis that then forces your hand into something that you may not want to do. So early stage decisions right now, like what happens when, a co-founder wants to leave or a co-founder passes away, they become more difficult. It's easier now. If you are a solo entrepreneur like myself, that could mean your whole business falls apart. So not having a succession plan, or at least, dictating what happens to clients, what happens to the business in general. Does it pass to somebody? In certain instances, your business cannot pass to somebody else. I can't give my business to my family members because they're not attorneys, they're not lawyers, right? So I have to find somebody else should I inevitably, pass away, but it happens to be before my time, right? Before I wind down my business, something has to happen to my business, and having that plan in place now and being able to maybe modify that plan, tweak that plan, is incredibly helpful.
So in a family-owned businesses, what kind of issues tend to surface when expectations about the future aren't clearly addressed up front?
When they aren't addressed up front, that's where the person goes, they have their business, and they are expecting a family member to take over. There's no other contingency. Well, what happens if that family member decides to go off and do something else, right? What happens if that family member decides that they don't want to be, or you don't want that family member to be part of the family, right? Family business, right? Another thing that happens is people assume that, oh, well, this will just pass to my family in my will. Not exactly, not necessarily. They may not want that. Your other business partners may not want that. So having the conversations in family-owned businesses, having those conversations to understand what that transition plan, that succession plan looks like is incredibly important. It prevents conflicts. More often than not, we see folks saying, well, Dad wanted me to take over the farm. I live in a rural community, right? Dad wanted me to take over the farm, but I don't want it. It's going to go to brother, brother doesn't want it. So then, we see this succession of people who, may not want this, and then it ends up just sitting there, sitting in probate because there was no succession plan and there was no way that it was then passed down to family members and any instructions on what to happen to the business, what to happen to the property that's connected to the business in that way. So family dynamics, having partners in a business can get pretty contentious. When they're family members, family dynamics tend to take over, and it becomes emotional. And so having that upfront, having those conversations, the most successful succession planning I've seen is actually out of a construction company in, up in Columbus, where family led, and maybe not completely family run, family led, family founded, but there was a succession plan, fun word, in place to have, the founder, the father, transition not only the responsibility making to his son and have his son succeed him, but also his equity as well, right? There was a rollback of his equity. So as he proceeded to transition out of that business, and other folks transitioned into it, he was not holding on with that iron death grip to the decision-making authority as a shareholder, as a majority shareholder. So the succession plan was really, 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 really thoughtful, and it was something that was put in place long before the son was ever, there was ever contemplation of this particular father stepping down. It was put in place after having conversation because he had two sons and other children, and they fully knew what this plan looked like and understood where they sat in the succession of this plan because they had very frank, very honest conversations.
So what parts of the business seem simple now but become complicated and contested later when there is no plan in place?
Yeah, the first is the ownership, right? The ownership, who owns what and who gets to make what decision. So, and I'll use the death, right? Because that's the ultimate, right? You cannot go back. If somebody wants out, they can at least still voice their opinions and what their desires are. And there's still some negotiating happening on if somebody wants to leave, right? It's more of a business divorce. But when a co-owner, co-founder, a member dies, right? And there's no lack of a buyout mechanism that can hold the business hostage in some ways, especially that particular person was a majority owner. If there has been no succession plan put in place, if they themselves did not come up with a way for their equity and their voting rights and their decision-making authority to either revert back to somebody else in the company or designating somebody in their family as an heir to be that particular person to step forward and assume all of those responsibilities, that company could be sitting there waiting for that ownership to go through the probate process and somebody to be appointed. They could be waiting, or even worse, they could have people on their board or have people involved in their business that they didn't want to have involved in their business at all. That dearly departed co-founder could be amazing, but they may not want that co-founder's family members involved in that particular business, right? So having often they're thought of as buy-sell agreements. having provisions in operating agreements, in shareholder agreements that say, hey, if somebody is incapacitated for a lengthy period of time, if someone has passed away and their equity automatically reverts to their heirs, we as the company have the ability to either buy them out. How do we do that? How much is it for? How do we determine that price for that buyout? Or do we allow them to move forward as becoming part of this company, and how do we accept them into this company? Do they still have the same amount of voting rights, or do we reduce their involvement, and do they become a non-voting member? I've done that for an operating agreement where if any of either of the members die and their equity reverts to their family members, those family members become non-voting family members or non-voting members. So they have the equity, so they can get the distributions, and they can still have a wealth generating mechanism, but they're not making any major decisions, and they're not holding that business hostage. One of the other issues is that client relationship, institutional knowledge, right? When somebody leaves, if they had key client relationships and now that person has died, that co-founder has died, how are they then going to move forward with those client relationships? That one is not as upsetting because usually if there are partners involved in a business, they tend to be a little bit more involved, and you can, create those relationships, and you can repair some of those relationships if they need to be repaired. The ownership tends to be a little bit more of an issue.
So how do documents like those operating agreements or shareholder agreements and estate plans work together as a part of that succession strategy? What breaks down if those don't align?
They all need to speak the same language, right? So some folks will say, oh, well, I have my operating agreement, and then when I die, I know I have my will, so I said my business is going to transition to my family in my will. Cool, fantastic, but understanding that, administration of a will may take a little bit of time. If you, put your equity into a trust, that's a little bit faster as it transitions over to your family members, right? But that's layer one. Layer two is then looking at your operating agreement, looking at your shareholder agreements, and looking at those transfers, looking at that power, looking at the ownership percentages, and really saying, okay, so if this does transition, right, we've got step one, but step two is, do I want to continue this business? And if I don't want to continue this business, do I have the ability to either sell to the other members, sell my equity back to the company? Can they take the equity from me? Is there a way for me to maybe keep the equity, take part in the distribution process, reap the benefits of the shares, but then not have to make any decisions? So I'm, a more passive in the business. Or is there a way for me, especially if this is a solo entrepreneur or sole member business, what are the mechanisms for selling the business? Should there be some sort of, death or incapacitation? What are the steps, and do I have the authority in selling that particular business? So, I always say, because folks will say like, oh, well, I just need an estate plan. Again, that's step one. And understanding that there are different layers in the estate planning process too, right? More often than not, if you're going the will route, yes, you are putting things in place, but that process is administered by the court. And if certain things are not done the right way, it can take a little bit. In working with a trust and understanding how that works, that may happen a little bit faster. So being able to understand how those processes work together and how those documents all work together and not against each other is incredibly important.
How does having that succession plan in place affect a business's ability to grow or bring partners on or attract buyers or investors down the line?
Yeah, having that in place is incredibly incredibly attractive because it shows that, you're forward thinking as a business owner. You've really put in place those mechanisms, especially if as your business is continuing to grow, you have those mechanisms that are, can prevent some of the disasters that an investor or, someone who might acquire your business wants to avoid. A family business, this makes it a lot more attractive for investors or for anybody who wants to finance. Because again, they know that there's some longevity, there's something in place, there's a little bit more predictability in what's happening. And also for, partners, any key new hires, for them, it's that signal that, committing long-term is more of an advantage because you have that clear structure for the future.
And to kind of wrap things up, for owners who, want to stay focused on running their business, today while still protecting its future, what helps succession planning feel practical instead of premature? What is a step that someone could take this week, Ms. Jasmin?
So succession planning isn't just a kind of a one and done. It's more continuity planning, right? Because things do change. At some point, I would hope that I'm no longer a solo entrepreneur. I have partners, which means I can lean on them, right? To say, if something happens, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, hopefully that doesn't happen. Everything transitions to them, right? You never know. It's always a possibility.
It's true. It's true.
It's 2026. But, those types of things, and it changes because your business changes. You may be by yourself. You may have partners. You may have family members. I hope that one day I'm able to add into my succession planning that my successor is my kids. They succeed me because they become attorneys, that sort of thing. That may not happen. So it is it's continuity planning. It's making sure that, you're protecting what you've built right now and then protecting it later on. And it will most likely change. I would say this week, take a look at your operating agreement, shareholder agreements. Identify those gaps. What happens if you die tomorrow? What happens to your business? What happens? Does it pass to somebody else? Does it pass to your family members? If you have estate planning documents in place, check those out. Is your business included? Is your business equity included in those documents? They should be, right? So taking a look at that and understanding if you have those documents in place, are they competing against each other or are they working together, and are they providing you continuity layers of protection and understanding? Definitely understanding those gaps and then reaching out to a business attorney and estate planner, if they happen to be both like myself. Hey, incredibly helpful, right? So to talk about what that looks like, and now is the time to put those in place. Now is the time to modify those. Now is the time to identify those gaps and have a plan. Being in business is about having a plan. It may go out the window tomorrow, but then you just create a new plan, right? So having that plan and taking that first step is incredibly important.
Miss Jasmin, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Evan. Have a good one. Bye.
Right, you too. That wraps up today's episode of the Main Street Counsel podcast. To learn more about Jasmin Hurley and how she helps Main Street business owners plan for continuity without panic, visit jhlegalohio.com. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to like, subscribe to the show, and leave a review if you found today's episode helpful. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.